Welcome to On Leadership, a midweek podcast from HDBB. We believe leadership is a posture, not a position, and in the same way postures can be improved, leaders can grow. We want to encourage you to keep going and to equip you with practical ways to grow as a leader. Thanks for tuning in to On Leadership.
Hey there, welcome to On Leadership. I'm Abel, and all this season, I've been really looking forward to this particular episode. This is one of the highest voted questions in the survey that we sent to leaders before On Leadership started. And the question of this episode is, how do I give and receive feedback? Here to answer the question and to have a conversation with me on this topic is my good friend, Dan Millest. Dan, you are the Associate Vicar of HDBB. You are the Director of Formation for SBTC, Theological College. You're the husband to Kate and the dad to the adorable Clara and Cassia. What does feedback look like to you in this season?
Yeah, hey there, Abel. Hey, everyone. Feedback in this season, I suppose giving feedback. We're giving a lot at the moment. We're potty training our twins, and every time they manage to go to the toilet in the potty, they get to watch an episode of Peppa Pig. And so that's like giving feedback.
I love that. That's so transferable to the management world now, Dan.
Yeah, my team are always watching Peppa Pig. And then I'm receiving a lot of feedback because pretty much anything we do for the girls at the moment, they suggest ways to improve it, or that it could be done in a better way. So giving and receiving a lot of feedback at home.
I love that. We've known each other for a while now. Dan, one of the things that I really appreciate about our friendship is that you're such a great conversationalist. This week alone, we've spent a couple of hours talking on the phone, just talking about a bunch of things in ministry and work and in our lives as well. And one of the things that I really appreciate about you is that you've got this clarity in giving feedback and a courage in giving feedback. But at the same time, you've got this humility in receiving feedback as well. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing more about what you think about this subject. How do we give and receive feedback well? But first, I'm fascinated by origin stories. So what is your origin story when it comes to feedback? Why is feedback important to you?
Yeah, I think I've thought a lot about feedback because I think I'm not naturally good at giving it or receiving it. I'm either too shy to give it or I'm too blunt when I do. So I've had to learn to give it. And also, I think I was a musician growing up. And I think especially during that teenage angsty period, you sort of attach a lot of your identity on what you're doing, and you're obviously getting a lot of feedback as a musician in an orchestra or there, and that worst moment where the conductor picks just you out and says play your bit, and you're like, you have to do it in front of everyone, and you're like, not only am I not going to be able to play this because I didn't do the prep work, I'm going to look really bad. And I think so I was very afraid of feedback. I think and partly we'll talk about why that sort of identity trigger, and sort of, I think, having to learn to see it as something that's really good. And actually, the better you get at something, the more feedback you should be expecting to receive and want to receive as well. So I think that's partly why I've thought a lot about it. I think the other aspect in my current job is through sort of the theological college. We're training people, so we're giving feedback.
Yes.
And also in the church, part of our role is to help raise up other people to preach. And so we've just had to work out, how do you give feedback in a way that, people have put themselves out there. So how do you do that in a way that is helpful, but doesn't crush people and helps them to grow? So yeah, we've thought a lot about it over the last few years, especially.
I'm fascinated to hear more about how you do it in terms of the mechanics, the practicalities of giving feedback well, but also how to receive feedback. And I think, we were talking about this beforehand, that giving and receiving feedback are not, dichotomies. They come hand in hand. In fact, to do one well, you have to do the other well as well. So to the listeners who are listening in right now and who are wondering, how do I start in this area of giving and receiving feedback well? What would you say then? How do we get better at feedback?
Well, I think it's first of all, just to quickly say what feedback is, because I think the culture we're in, the odds are stacked against us because we live in the world of the worst type of feedback, which is the which tells us nothing or is very ambiguous. You have feedback of appreciation, of coaching, of evaluation, those different things. But I think that the key thing to remember in all of it is that the receiver is the gatekeeper. The receiver is the gatekeeper. So you can get as good as you like at giving feedback. Actually, it's up to the receiver whether or not it will be received or acted upon. And so that it's important to remember, therefore, that it's really relational in giving feedback. And therefore, you become a good feedback giver by being a better feedback receiver. And so if you're not hungry for feedback, actually doesn't matter what you say, even if it's really insightful, you've already sort of hamstrung yourself if you're not willing to receive it yourself from people above you, which kind of we expect, but also from people maybe organizationally below you or with less experience than you. And so you need to be willing to give it as well, willing to receive it in all directions as well as giving it.
Yes. Pastor Benny Ho, who is speaking at HTBB this coming Sunday, says that leadership is really three things: communicate, care, and chart. And when you think about it, they're all about feedback, right? It's all about giving feedback and receiving feedback as well. It's a matter of communicating, caring, and charting direction as well. So then, what's your advice on how to grow the muscle of receiving feedback well?
So I think first it's recognized that there's different types of feedback. So some of it's positive feedback. And actually, it's worth noting that we don't all receive positive feedback really well. And sometimes it's like somebody says something nice about you and you're like, no, here are 10 reasons why you're wrong. And it's like, and so I think, first of all, just on the easy way, receive good feedback, say thanks, accept it, acknowledge it, and then maybe widen it. So if somebody says, this is going really well, you go, yeah, thank you. And then acknowledge those other people who are working alongside. So I think yes. Receive the positive and then just be aware of why the negative is hard to receive. And it's said that there are 3 triggers that stop us from wanting to receive negative. And I mean, even calling it negative is slightly a slight misconception, but we'll just call it there for clarity's sake now. But say the first one is the truth trigger. That somebody gives you feedback and you're like, no, you're wrong. You're like, and sometimes it's not that they're 100% wrong, but we focus on the 10% where they're not quite right or wrong. And you focus on that. And there's like a comedy show in the 90s, guy called Blackadder. And he asks the captain of a ship what opinion is. And he says, the captain says, well, opinion is divided. The whole world thinks this is this way, and I disagree. And it's that sense of those moments of you just pick the one thing that is wrong and you dismiss everything else. So that's the truth trigger. The next is the relationship trigger, which is who are you to tell me? And that's either because you don't respect the person or you don't like them, or if position and hierarchy is very important in your organization, then it's who's allowed to speak to different people, and
right.
And again, that's a really important one to be aware of nowadays, and just be thinking, because I think we've come, it's very unhealthy to not be willing to listen to all parts of a team, and the challenge there is to separate the who from the what. And often, if I'm honest, my bigger reaction is not to what people are saying, but it's who that is saying it. So that's the relationship trigger. And then the last one's the identity trigger. And I think this is probably the biggest one, is because when somebody criticizes you or challenges you on your ability, often we receive it as an attack on my identity. And this is the emotional reaction to the feedback. And that's the harder one, I think, and the most important one to think about.
Right. So how do you navigate through those 3?
Well, I think the truth one is just acknowledging that there's always something to take from the feedback. There's, even if, say, you don't agree with all of it, first of all, you should receive it and think about it. And there's always good stuff to be gained. The relationship one, again, is that being open and thinking that actually everybody you encounter, that they have something to share. And I think part of that is that thing of that none of us can answer the question, what's it like to be on the other side of me? None of us can answer that. without other people. And so it doesn't matter what you think about that person. They bring something of an answer to that question that you have no way of getting unless you listen to them. And I think we maybe expand on that a bit later, but that's why we should be open at the end of the day, because everything we do in leadership is relational. So we need to be open to it. I think the identity trigger, it's all about the story you're telling yourself. It's like the story you tell about feedback has a massive impact on how you feel about the feedback. The best illustration is Michaela Maroney, best gymnast in the world. She went into the 2012 Olympics, but there was a mistake. She stumbled, so she took silver in the end. And the photo of her was her on the podium with the silver medal. Look, really
I remember that picture. It was iconic.
Yeah, and it became a meme. Michaela Maroney is not impressed. And if you think about it, she's the second best gymnast in the world, but she's not impressed. And it's and the question was asked on the Olympic podium, who's the happiest? And it's not a trick question. It's the person who got gold. But then you ask, well, who's the second happiest? And actually, it's probably the person who took the bronze medal, because the bronze medalist is saying to themselves, yay, I made the podium.
Didn't expect to win.
Didn't expect to get it, but I made the podium. But the silver medalist is like, I missed out on the gold. And so the story you tell about yourself and the feedback you're receiving massively impacts our ability to accept it or to dismiss it. So one reaction is, I'm devastated. And it's like somebody said, I'm not quite sure that's accurate. And it's like you've Googled all the things that are wrong with me. And it's got like 1 million hits with sponsored ads from your auntie and your boss and your ex. And it's like, and basically you're just focusing on everything that's wrong. And it's because you're not thinking, well, what are the things that I've done well? Like this feedback was on one aspect. It wasn't on everything. So that's one reaction, is to be devastated. The other is to go meh and just ignore it. This is this person who's insensitive or unsensitive to feedback, and you're not able to take the hints, or you hear it and then you forget it. And they say we often do this. We dismiss feedback because we often think about and describe ourselves based on our own good intentions. Like, nobody, I don't believe anyone goes into work or into anything thinking, I'm going to really mess this up intentionally. No, nobody does that. And so, but we're quite willing to give ourselves the benefit of the doubt in that. And so we can go, oh yeah, I've heard that feedback, but I didn't intend that. So you kind of ignore it. And both ends of the spectrum come from having a fixed mindset, which basically says, I am who I am.
Yes.
And I don't need to change, or I'm unable to change is often the thing. Whereas the moment you have a growth mindset, feedback becomes something you're hungry for, because I want to grow, because I'm not yet finished. And that's where that phrase...
And the only way you can grow is through feedback.
Yeah.
Either from your circumstances or from people.
Yeah, the only way we learn, the only way we feedback, the only way you can work something out is by feedback, having that, thought through process in your head and with other people. And that's that phrase, feedback is the breakfast of champions. And I love it. It's like, when say you're on as a kid, you're on a football team, you have one coach for like 20 kids. But actually, the higher up and the better up you get at something, actually, the more coaches you need. And so like, on a professional football team, there is a coach for shooting, a coach for passing, a coach for recovery, a coach for getting ready, and different individual coaches. And so it's that thing of if you want to get better, you should expect to be receiving more feedback, not less as you go.
Yes. Really helpful, Dan. That's really, really insightful. So we've established that the key to giving feedback well is to first start with receiving feedback well. And there are ways to develop a growth mindset around receiving feedback. Are there any other practical ways, like on a sort of day-to-day basis, then when you do receive feedback from someone, let's say, your boss, or let's say someone who's more senior to you in leadership or in ministry, what are some of the practical things that you do in that moment in order for you to receive feedback well?
Yeah, I think this would be my main takeaway, is that understanding is more important than agreeing. Understanding is more important than agreeing. And this was something Kate and I were going through a patch, my wife Kate and I, where we just couldn't find agreement. And our friends, we were chatting it through with another couple, and they just said, look, understanding is more important than agreeing. And actually, the irony being, as soon as we took the pressure off of, we've got to agree on this, because actually when we stood back, we're like, actually, we don't need to fully agree. There's no pressure. It wasn't like, oh, what are we going to do now? It was, so we didn't need to agree. But as soon as we took the pressure off agreeing, it made it easier for us to understand each other. And pretty much as soon as we understood each other, that was actually the problem in the end.
Dang.
So,
Right.
I think that's key for most things. So I think, give people permission for feedback is like a simple one. But then when you get it, just ask for people to be specific. So, can you explain that? Or you rephrase it back to them. You say, hey, I heard you say this to me that I came across in this way in the team meeting. And I think you were saying it's because of the tone that I was using. Is that right? And so you're asking clarifying questions when obviously in the moment you just want to go, no, that's not what I meant. Or no, what I said, and you're immediately judging. And again, a friend of mine said, it's way more fun to play detective than judge. Because judge just goes, yeah, no. Whereas detective goes, tell me more. What did you mean by that? Oh, could you explain that? And it's more open. So I think asking questions for clarity is just the simplest thing, and trying to understand where it is that person is coming from before you evaluate it.
Very good. To just give space for yourself and for the other person to understand. I heard another person say it is better to understand than to be understood. In moments of feedback, that seems to be helpful advice as well.
Yeah, I think first of all, to say it's so important. Like we can't do any of the things like, we have these culture values that we say, this is us at our best. And I was going through going, which ones does feedback impact? And I was like, it's all of them. You can't do any of them without feedback. And actually you do everything worse if you don't. Patrick Lencioni was the management guy, was speaking at the leadership conference in London a few years ago. And he said, do you know why it is that so many people get hurt who work in charities and for churches? And he said, the answer is because they only hire really horrible, nasty people. And they just went quiet. He said, obviously that's not true. He says, we hire lovely people who aren't very good at giving feedback. And I think it's quite interesting, especially in sort of charity or volunteer or church setting, because sometimes you think, I don't want to give feedback because people are volunteering of their time and therefore I owe them. And we think of feedback as something that we're taking from them. But it's actually, and he then basically said, look, if you don't give feedback, people end up hurt more. And he told this sort of story of Gladys, who to celebrate the church's birthday wants to have a balloon festival, and no one wants to tell her it's a bad idea. So they say, go ahead and do it. And she does it, but nobody helps because they think it's a bad idea. And eventually she's crushed and defeated, but at least we didn't tell her that her idea wasn't any good. And you just see that happening. And so I think, so it's really important. It's an act of love to give feedback. But obviously you then have to do it in a loving way. So how do you do it in a loving way? I think give people the benefit of the doubt. Nobody goes into it thinking I'm intentionally going to mess it up. One of my managers, a woman called Rebecca Stewart, used to have some great language around this. She would just say to people, say something gone wrong. She'd go to people, she said it's important to go soon, and say, oh, so how do you think that went? And she said 9 times out of 10, they go, I really messed that up. And she said, and she could go, okay, great. Let's look at this together. And she said 1 time out of 10, somebody go, oh, it went really well. And she would then say, oh, well, that surprises me because of this, this, and this. But she's given them the benefit of the doubt. And it's so much easier when somebody goes, they own it, and they go, I've done it wrong. And then you're just partnering with them in moving forwards. So I think give the benefit of the doubt. And
that's a brilliant way of using coaching questions as well in giving feedback.
Yeah.
Because you're starting from the place of assuming that people already have the self-awareness about what needs to improve. And so you can ask questions in order for them to come to that realization on their own.
And also, it's just 10 times easier. I've always just thought anybody who wants to be discipled or wants to grow, they grow. They're just like, but anybody who doesn't really want to be, it's like pushing water uphill. But the moment somebody wants it, it just works. And I think if you give them that opportunity to own it, so that you've avoided that identity trigger and relationship trigger because they've taken it on themselves, you've saved yourself half the work as well. Then I think it's making sure that it's an ongoing conversation. This isn't the end of you. This is like, so it's talking about what happened. It's, we talk about it's done in relationship. You've said, I'm with you in this. Sandy Miller, who was the vicar of HTB Church in London, used to say that anonymous feedback is useless. And that's pretty direct. But I think, I think it's because so much of feedback is relational. And actually, you can only really work out the truth of it or the value of it in relationship. And so anonymous feedback tends to be useless. I think obviously there are times where you need to protect somebody if somebody's vulnerable, and so that it doesn't apply to that. But in sort of regular work life, it doesn't help. Partly because
it's quite hard to do life on life if it's anonymous.
Yeah, and a
impossible.
lot of the things we need feedback on are cultural. Is the how you've done something, not just what you've done. And so if somebody doesn't understand the culture you're working in in your organization, then actually that might be the cause of the feedback. It's just a lot harder if it's anonymous, I think. And so I think as the giver, you want to make sure it's a priority to keep the feedback discussable. This isn't the last word on you or the issue. We're talking about what happened here. And sometimes people just need a bit of time to process, to help them receive it. So if time can be given, I think that's why it's sometimes good to deal with things quicker. I think, the later the feedback, it tends to be the greater the feedback has to be. But whereas if something's gone badly and you just say, hey, let's talk, that didn't quite go well, let's think about it, let's talk about this next week, you've addressed it, they're not feeling abandoned, and they've got time to process it. So I think that's good.
Dan, you've covered so much, and I think there's a lot of helpful insights in what you just said. So I'm just going to do a quick recap, and then perhaps you can fill this in before we conclude this episode. You've talked a lot about how to first focus on receiving feedback well, because that's the foundation of feedback. It's in the receiving of feedback that we learn how to give feedback as well. You've talked about a few practical handles on how to give feedback well. This sense of time, make sure that it's recent and quick and small rather than delayed and big. You've talked about how it should be specific, focus on one thing at a time. Be careful with the feedback sandwich, because sometimes, that may create, a sort of anticipation for the wrong thing. Sometimes it's more helpful to be clear and kind in the way that you give feedback rather than to sort of sugarcoat it in something that may not actually be truthful. And I think one of the most valuable things you said is also focus on the relationship. Build a bank of positive feedback and trust, because that then allows you to get to a place where you can engage in more constructive feedback. So ultimately, it's all on the on this concept of trust, that it's the capital of feedback, and every chance we get, shine a light at something that's already working, shine a light at what is growing and, living, in order for there to be a healthier culture of feedback. Would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I think that's key. If somebody's doing something and it's not working in one area, but they've got something working in a different area of their work or life, and they're applicable, just point to that. You can celebrate them on that. You can say, look, this was so good. This didn't work. Why don't you do things the way you do them here in that? Because they've already done the contextualization. They've already come up with the idea. It's solved so many. They believe they can do it. So it's turning on the light rather than fighting the darkness, looking for the bright spots. And I just think with Jesus and his disciples, you just see this constantly. He's constantly affirming them and challenging them. And you need both to have meaning in life. You need to be affirmed, but you also need challenge as well. And if you take challenge out, actually, ultimately, you take meaning and purpose out from people, which is the worst thing that you could do to anyone in many ways, especially if you're in authority or managing them. But I just think the cross in some ways is the ultimate feedback. There's this Tim Keller quote that says that the cross tells us that we're more sinful than you ever realized, and yet more loved than you ever dared hope. And I think it's those two things there, that it's a really accurate assessment on who we are. And then it's this promise of God's presence, his with you-ness, his investedness in you. And it holds those two things perfectly in tension. And in a way, and it's painful. It's a cross, but it's also a symbol of hope, and it's this symbol of something that's changed the entire world. And so I think whenever you're struggling, you think this is really hard, either to receive feedback or give feedback, you can look to the cross and think, no, it is a place of life, even when it seems there's not much life, there is life promised there.
Fantastic. Dan, thank you for your time. This has been really helpful, and well done to those of you who are listening to this point. We hope this has been very helpful and hopeful for you as you try to grow in this practice of feedback. We'll see you for next week's episode of On Leadership. Have a good week now. Bye.
Thanks for listening to On Leadership. We hope you found this episode helpful. If you did, why not share it with a friend or post it on social media? Whatever platform you're listening on, don't forget to like, subscribe, or follow and turn on your notifications to receive more great content from HTBB.